All right, well, let's get going then. All right, well, welcome to the Tuesday, March 14th, 2023 working session, meeting the Ann Arbor Planning Commission. No decisions are occurring tonight, and we're going to get a presentation that I think is making its rounds to several of the commissions. And I think Commissioner Dish and I actually already heard this at Environmental Commission, and it was very informative. So I think you all are going to enjoy it a lot. But I think we will move first into public comment. I don't know if we have any attendees that are remote.
I'm checking for hands raised, Madam Chair, and I do not see any at this time.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if I should even, it's not necessarily something where people would comment as much. So I think I'm just going to skip if nobody's there. And we'll move on to the presentation. I don't know if somebody from staff wants to do any kind of intro.
Yes, I would like to. So this is Hank Kelly, Deputy Planning Manager. I'll just give a short self-description. I am wearing a green button down. I have brown salt and pepper hair, and I use they, them pronouns. This evening, we will have a presentation by Heather Seyfarth, formerly of the city system planning team, and now with the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, who created and led the Equitable Engagement Initiative. Heather will be presenting a report to us this evening that seeks to define equity and a set of recommendations to improve city engagement. This will provide an opportunity for the Planning Commission to hear how the work was performed, what the recommendations are, and offer some dialogue and feedback before the report is finalized. And at this time, Heather, I would invite you to introduce anything that I have neglected to say about yourself or your work, and take it away to introduce the project.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I'll start off with a confession, and that confession is that I'm at City Hall. I thought this was an in-person meeting, so I made it all the way down here, and I'm sad that I don't get to talk with you in person, because I always enjoy just work sessions where we can sit around and talk, especially over a topic like this. But in any case, here I am, and here all of you are virtually, and I will just jump into my presentation. Thank you for that introduction, Hank. I appreciate that. So I'll go through my presentation. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions along the way, or we can talk about it after I'm done. So I will share my screen and get my presentation up and running. All right, can everybody see that okay? Thumbs up. All right, great. And we made this presentation fairly short because we did want to offer a lot of time for discussion, but I'm happy to go into anything a little bit deeper if anybody wants. So to start off with, to tell you about the whole purpose of the project, the city of Ann Arbor, both as a government and as a community, aims to be more inclusive. We do express that we have the basic principle of being a welcoming community, and engagement is a key part of that. But what we were finding is that we were getting a lot of the same people at our meetings, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So we sought to be able to have engagement where we were having a more representative selection of our community come to our meetings and take our surveys and any other way that you engage with the city. So what we wanted to do with this project is to get different voices than we typically get, to help us get a shared definition of what equity means, and then to help us develop some policies and guidelines and practices so that we can move forward with engagement in a more equitable fashion. So this is the demographic data that we were starting with. We began this back in 2019. We wanted to get a sense of who was coming to our meetings and taking our surveys. We had a general sense of that, but we wanted to get the data behind it. So what we did is we developed a survey to get people's demographic data. This is optional. People didn't have to take this, but we did request it, and many people did. And so as you can see on here, we were getting mostly, to get down to it, we were getting older white homeowners at our meetings and taking our surveys, which is not representative of our general population. And you can see the comparison between our census data and the people that we were getting to engage with us. So as we began this journey, we collected city staff to get together to figure out how we wanted to approach this. And we realized that we needed to spend some time educating ourselves first. And so it started off with trying to figure out what we're doing now. Let's get our baseline of what the work is that we're doing now. What we have done in the past is we have a community engagement toolkit. This is something that we've had around for a long time, almost 10 years, but it's not universally used in the city, and that's something that we want to remedy. What this community engagement toolkit does is it takes staff through a series of questions to think through how to approach a project with engagement. So how to scale it, for example, and who are the people that we should invite. One of the components of the toolkit is a list of people that's ever growing of different entities and individuals that we want to make sure that we invite to our events. We also do our demographic data collection, which is what I just went over. We started also doing staff training on engagement best practices. And this is where we brought in an agency called the International Association of Public Participation. And we had training for staff. Again, this was right before COVID. So we started to roll this out and getting a number of staff members to do this training, but it was kind of cut off after COVID hit. We also have done youth engagement efforts throughout the years. One of the more recent ones, which you'll see in the appendix of the report, is that we ran a class for community high school. And this class was meant to help students learn how city government works, as well as helping them understand the role that they have and that they do have a role to play in helping us make decisions about the community that will be the community that potentially they'll be adults in the future. We also have something called the Developer Public Participation Requirement, which I think all of you are really familiar with. This is a little bit above and beyond what many communities do. We wanted to make sure that we included this as a listing of things that we do for engagement, because it is something that not all communities do. We also needed to educate ourselves on what other communities were doing. So we did a survey of really just what other communities were doing in terms of advancing equity, who was thinking about it to begin with, and what were some of the practices that they were doing. And then we wanted to educate ourselves on what were the local conditions. So what are we starting with? And for that, we looked a lot at the Opportunity Index. If you're familiar with that, that's something that the county has put together, as well as looking at ALICE reports, which is something that United Way puts together that does a little bit of a deeper dive than just census data in terms of how families are faring, how individuals and families are faring in terms of being able to financially survive. And so we looked at a variety of data sources, again, just to get ourselves a baseline understanding of what are the existing conditions today. So from there, we launched into making this a process that was driven by the community, and we put out a call for applicants. We ended up getting 80 applicants. This is in part, I think, in large part because there is a craving for this. Many community members are really looking for ways to diversify the voices. We also spent a lot of time thinking through how we could get the word out. So we took some different approaches. We did the typical stuff where we sent some stuff out over social media. We did a press release. We posted it on all of our media that we have out there in terms of our website. But we also worked with Meals on Wheels to get the word out. We did a PSA on CTN. We also put up flyers around town, which is something that we have found is effective. It seems like an old-fashioned thing to do, to actually put physical flyers out there, but we're going back to it because we're finding that it captures people that we don't typically get. On our listservs, that's another way we got the word out, is just through our growing listserv that we have. But again, those are typically the same people that we're reaching over and over again. So we ended up getting, as I mentioned, 80 applicants for this, and we needed to narrow that down because we thought that would be a lot of people to work with, even though we were thrilled to have that many applicants. We ended up narrowing it down to 30 people, which we still felt was a large steering committee, but we just didn't want to narrow it down any further just because we had so many good applicants. And from there, we started defining what equity was and defining what the core values were, and ultimately developed the recommendations that you see in the report. So this is the definition that the group came up with, and it distinguishes between equity and equality. So equity is the fair and just practices that ensure all community members can thrive. Equitable practices acknowledge and address structural inequities, historic and current, that advantage some and disadvantage others. Meanwhile, equality treats everyone as if their experiences are the exact same. So again, this is the definition that the group came up with. The topics that we covered with the steering committee, we really began this again with starting at learning together, trying to get a baseline of what existing conditions were. So we looked at the opportunity index. That was one of the first things that we did. We reviewed the demographic data of engagement participants. We looked at the engagement toolkit. We asked participants in the steering committee to review that for us, critique it, tear it apart, put it back together. Reflect on engagement efforts that took place. So early on in this, the American Rescue Plan Act was going on, and we did an engagement effort for that, as many of you probably remember. So we had members of the group do some reflection on that and give us the good and bad and ugly of how we handled that. We also looked at land use planning. Many of the members were really interested in how land use planning was addressed and how decisions were made related to land use planning. So Brett was gracious enough to spend some time talking about that with the group. We looked at affordable housing, and this is another key topic of group members that they wanted to hear more about. So we had Jennifer Hall come and talk about that. City hiring practices was a key topic that people wanted to address as well. That article that many of you might remember came out just as the group was getting started, where it showed that many of the people that work for the city are white men, and it's primarily white men that are in the higher positions at the city. So people wanted to talk a lot about that. We also talked about sustainability efforts, and then of course the building blocks of meaningful engagement. This is something that the group came up with as we started talking about these and then tying it back to engagement. And this is just a visual that gives a sense of how we want engagement to influence the decision-making around these topics. And it's a paw. And so the idea is that if we have equitable engagement, then we'll have good grounding for decision-making on these topics. So this brings us into the recommendations. And I realized in my presentation that this is truncated a little bit, so I'm actually going to open up my report and list the recommendations in here. So recommendation 1 is to demonstrate that the city is committed to advancing equity. And the reason behind this is because the group wants to see that people who have been minoritized and marginalized will not engage with the city if the city is not representative or clearly committed to supporting equity. And some of the strategies under this are the city intentionally hires minoritized individuals, especially in higher level positions, create transparent and meaningful pathways for promotion in minoritized individuals, appoint racially and ethnically minoritized candidates representing impacted community perspectives to boards and commissions, and City Council adopts and enforces policies that help ensure decision-making is equitable and possible. And there are a number of possible policy statements that are included in this, which I won't go over now, but we can come back to that if anybody has any questions about that. Another strategy is to be authentic, and what this means is starting with authentic, honest conversations about the reality and the situation related to equity within the city of Ann Arbor and our history. And then another strategy is to build trust and transparency through continuous outreach and relationship building. So the second recommendation is to provide both ample and targeted invitations to engagement opportunities And the reason why behind this is because people need to be made aware of opportunities in addition to feeling welcome and valued at engagement events. So the first strategy in this is to translate and transcreate, which means adapting a message from one language to another while maintaining its intent, style, and tone and context, with meeting notices and content addressing the most commonly spoken languages at first. Another strategy is, in addition to social media and email, use non-digital ways of getting the word out, such as flyers, word of mouth, using phone tree, other methods like that, using door hangers, including posting at community hubs, for example, community centers and libraries and schools. Another strategy is to get the word out through places like religious institutions, barbershops, bus stops, and informal networks. The next strategy is to actively recruit Black, Indigenous, and people of color to participate in engagement events. And then finally, create an online engagement hub that is easy to find and use. All right, the third recommendation is to develop community engagement plans with care. And the reason behind this is that community engagement plans are the blueprint for ensuring quality, equitable engagement. And the strategies that we have behind this are basically to provide the resources necessary for staff to conduct meaningful engagement. So that's ensuring that the budget is available, continue to increase staff training, continue to use and evolve the city's community engagement toolkit, and then create suitable measurements and milestones for successful engagement. So finding ways to make sure we are being effective at our engagement by measuring it. And then recommendation 4, the last recommendation, is to make engagement events more accessible and attractive. And the reason behind this is that engagement events that are not easy to access, seem unimportant, or feel hostile, deter people from engaging. So the strategies, and I have more than what's listed on the slide here in front of me, which I'll read to you. This first strategy is to offer hybrid meeting options. Another strategy is to provide various ways for people to provide their input, ways that avoid dominant people and narratives from taking over meetings, hold meetings at various times, record meetings and make them easily available and provide input opportunities after watching recorded meetings, hold people to the golden rule standards, use and enforce ground rules that support honoring the dignity of people, understand that community's time and energy is valuable, especially for people with limited resources, compensate participants in some ways, such as with food, stipends, gift certificates, etc. Another one is to hire trained and continue to train meeting facilitators and moderators in fields such as social work, psychology, diversity, equity, and inclusion, public participation, etc. Create space to listen to and heal old wounds using highly trained engagement facilitators. And then take time to celebrate and experience joy as a community. And then finally, when a decision is being made, clearly communicate what the decision is, the decision-making process, who ultimately makes the decision, and the level of influence the community can have over the decision. And that moves us into some promising practices. Some of what we learned is that community liaison programs in other communities have been really successful. And that's something that we see this group moving into. Working with different projects, for example, the comprehensive plan that's coming up, we might have a scenario where we're paying members of this group, the Equitable Engagement Committee, or people in their network that serve as liaisons to the community. And then measuring participant satisfaction. So always checking in with ourselves, checking in with our community to see how we're doing. Having the mix of meeting styles, which I mentioned in one of the recommendations. So not just having the old school town hall meeting where somebody stands at the podium, because that can be very intimidating. And we often get a lot of dominant voices that way, but having other types of meetings like charrettes, small group conversation, things like that. Information kiosks, that's something that is coming up and popping up in other communities that we're seeing as a potential here. And that would be kiosks that are stationed around the city. So that way we're reaching people that are on the edges, not just downtown, but places where people can go to find out what's happening at the community or even take a survey. Doing more surveys and polling. This is kind of mixed because we do a lot of surveys already, but we seem to get a lot of responses from that. So I think we'll continue to do that, but probably doing it in a variety of different ways. Most of our surveys are digital. We might go back to doing some hand surveys. We do a little bit of that already where we do paper copies that we hand out to housing commission sites, for example. But perhaps we'll get into leaving them at libraries and other places like that, just to make it easier for people that might not have as much digital access or just find it simply easier just to write out a survey. And then the engagement hub. So this is something that we started exploring while we were working with the community, with the committee, with a team of students from U of M, looking at, again, best practices from other communities and engagement hubs that make a really interactive website for people. And it's a one-stop shop that people can come to see ways that they can engage with the city, either with projects that are going on, with surveys that are available, or even volunteer opportunities. So we have something that approximates this already, where it just lists different projects and different websites that people can access. But we would like to have something that's a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more visual, that's a lot more user-friendly to people. So this is an example of one. And this I really like because it gives it's really easy to navigate. It has a lot of visuals to it. You can click on, these are called cards, what you see on here, and learn more about a project and find ways to be engaged with it. So that is something that might be on the near-term horizon for us that we'll be implementing from the recommendations in this report. And that is it. So this is the link to the site that you can go to learn more about the Equitable Engagement Initiative and see more about the committee itself, who's on the committee, and even watch meetings. And if you have any comments, if you've had time to read through the report, which I encourage you to do, we'd love to hear your thoughts on it. We are continuing to accept comments. We do review, we're probably going to do a final draft of this report to give to City Council, but we look at engagement as something that's ever evolving. So we'll continuously be looking at these recommendations and potentially adding to them as we go along and modifying them as we need to and learn more. All right, with that, I'm going to stop sharing to see if anybody wants to jump in with some comments or a conversation.
I will kick things off actually, because I had the opportunity to hear about this from before too. So I've had some things cooking in my head. So it's my understanding that we're kind of bound to the Roberts Rules format for Planning Commission. I think all of us, I'm sure, have felt at times that it's not necessarily the the easiest way for people to be able to participate when you have these really rigid timeframes, and the order of things can feel really counterintuitive in terms of like reading the motion first for the development. It feels like it's passed before we ever even vote on things to somebody who never comes to a meeting. There's just like a bunch of things that make it, I think, kind of clunky and opaque for somebody who's coming in just for the first time. And so I know that, I mean, I guess I've just only ever operated under this format before. I'm sure that there are legal reasons why we need to use it this way. I'm just wondering if you all have thought, I mean, I know planning decisions are things that people really care about and often want to come and participate in. And is your idea that that maybe some of the community liaisons would kind of be able to take on a more informal format for people to be able to weigh in on things or be able to ask questions or actually to have a dialogue? It's like we can't even really have an active dialogue with people from the public. It's like we hear all of them in one time. If they're lucky, we take whatever their comments are and talk about them in our discussion, but it's very separated temporally from when they actually ask the question. Like it's just a counterintuitive, clunky format for working with citizens. At the same time, I'm going to say that I went as I'm a petitioner too. I'm a landscape architect. I work in other communities, and I went to one from an unnamed township that was utter chaos. And I was like, wow, it's really good that we have Robert's rules because it was mayhem. It was total mayhem. It got spun completely out of control. People were screaming at each other. And I mean, it was awful. So is there any happy medium here that we can, I mean, have you all thought about this? I'm sure that you're working across all different kinds of commissions and all different kinds of formats. It's not just what we're bound to do. But I'm just wondering if, as you talked with people, if you've kind of thought about, I mean, many of the commissions, adhere to that format. So I'm just wondering if you've had any thoughts about that as how to kind of dovetail the recommendations that you have with what we're kind of bound to do as a commission.
Yeah, and some of the format we can't change. We can't really do much about because of the requirements, especially with public hearings, for example. That's just kind of written out. You have to do it the way you have to do that. But I think everything building up to it, for example, with a comprehensive plan, that might be a good example, or with a street project. I worked a lot on street projects. We can have meetings that are less formal than that or a different style than that to gather community input before a public hearing. And so those can be done in a variety of different ways. And that goes back to our community engagement toolkit and making our engagement plans with care. So really sitting down with the team internally, or if we have a consultant and thinking about how do we want to scale this, for example, is this a community-wide decision, or does this feel more like it needs to be the neighborhood needs to be the focus? And so thinking through things like that. If there's opportunities to get youth involved, for example, what are the most effective ways to ask our questions? What are the questions we're even asking, right? So we want to be really clear with people, which we haven't always been good at, that we're asking a specific question and that we're making it very clear that the community has influence over this particular aspect of the project. Sometimes we've gone out there and said, what do you want? But that's not really what we're offering. We're not this isn't a blank slate that they can create. It might be a situation where they can have influence over a certain aspect of a design of a project or something like that. So thinking through all of that and then working with the community in a way that is productive. Yeah, we definitely don't ever want to get into a chaotic setting. And if we do expect something to be controversial, that's something also that we go over in our toolkit. So what are the hot button issues? Where do we feel like people are going to be explosive, and try to, not that we want to mask opinions or suppress opinions, but we want to be able to manage that in a way where people are talking respectfully to each other and that we are actually getting productive dialogue instead of people just trying to overpower one another.
So if you've gone out, just to follow up on that,
Mm-hmm.
And you have, a more informal dialogue or whatever, how would we get that information, I guess, is what I would be curious about. Does that come through staff? Is it come through, like, what would you imagine if we do have some level of that to a certain extent with some of our, they're supposed to have a citizen participation meeting and, things like that. We get a report from that, but it's run by the developer. There's nobody from the city present. They're supposed to take notes, and so we're kind of going on faith, of what they saw and heard. And I don't think people are, necessarily being nefarious about how they're doing those things, but I'm just wondering how we would get the information if we have something other than a different format than just the citizen participation meeting. Like, what would you envision that could look like?
Yeah, and that is something else that we put into our toolkit, is we determine how it's going to be recorded, basically. So how are we going to capture that information? And it typically would be staff, or if we have a consultant on board, recording that in some way. So if it's a flip charting situation, making sure that's written down, and hopefully themed and organized before it ever comes to you, the decision makers. So that would be, one way to do it. There's other ways to capture it. Of course, we've done a lot online lately, so we've been capturing it through actual recordings of meetings, but then we're also writing down different notes so that it can be easily digested by decision makers.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Dish.
I wanted to first defer to Mr. Leonard because I think he wanted to answer some of your questions, Chair Gibrandal. Is that correct?
That sounds great.
Commissioner Dish, you're always so kind to me. I want to be clear on something. You talked about Robert's Rules of Order, and I'd like to go a step further. Robert's Rules of Order is terrible. It's a terrible way to run a meeting, right? It's like you said, it's rigid. It's weird. There are certain rules about how different functions have to happen. And I want to be clear, Robert's Rules is a backstop, but particularly Commissioner Gibrandal, you as the chair have discretion to conduct the meeting in the manner that you think benefits the commission. Our bylaws do not say the Planning Commission shall conduct its meetings according to Robert's Rules. It says we are going to use Robert's Rules unless we think that there is a better approach or flexibility would benefit. And so that's one point I wanted to make. A way that Robert's Rules is really awesome is that it does provide a structure for fair due process of how we conduct business. Think about, without that structure, you as the chair on the fly trying to find the right balance of maybe a more free-flowing dialogue that is fair and equitable to both members of the public, to the petitioner at the table, to commissioners. That can be challenging. That's not to say you couldn't explore ways to do that in different ways. We do have to meet the requirements of public hearings. We do have to meet the requirements of meeting the standards by which we're making decisions. But so I just wanted to both echo caution. We have flexibility to think about new ways to approach some of that. But I just want to also caution, it's not easy probably to chart our own course and make sure we're hitting all those marks.
Agreed. Thank you. Now, Councilperson Dish.
Thank you. So I am hearing, I'm really, as we said the other night, this is an impressive amount of work, and I'm just really pleased to see it and grateful to you for doing it. I am hearing a couple of broad themes that I think are really important, and I want to underscore what I have heard. And one is that our model needs to shift. We are good at notification. We are less good at engagement, and notification works for the people who seek us out and know where to look or have signed up for the alerts that we send. And so we need to shift from providing information from people who seek us out or sign up for it to seeking out others and actively inviting them multiple times in whatever ways they need. And I hear you moving towards that. I loved what you said about the high school students. I think the things that you gave them were very good. And yet at the same time, when you mentioned creating space to listen to and heal old wounds using trained and experienced facilitators, which clearly describes what has been going on at 121 East Catherine, that is a different model. That's not us teaching them about how we do things, but it's us learning how they feel about us and how they do things and how they want us to do things. And of course, the Planning Commission is never going to look like a 121 East Catherine engagement meeting, and it shouldn't, but it is true that this is a big shift in our model, and I think we need to be aware of it, and also aware of how easy it is to do what we always do, but do it a little better. So the engagement hub sounds exciting to me. I hope we'll do that. But that's a better version of what we're doing. That makes it easier for people to find surveys and volunteer opportunities and look for things. Again, it's them seeking us out. And until we get, if we can engage some new people and sort of get them in that system, that's good. Maybe they'll use it. But that's going to make, and obviously vibrancy is really important. I'm not knocking that. That will be a big effort. It will be a big investment, and it will be a good thing. but it's this shift in style of that requires real community, almost community organizing. I think that's difficult, and I don't think that the cities really has the capacity necessarily to do that. And I think it is interesting to think about outsourcing in the way that you've suggested. And by outsourcing, I mean forming, finding, and training community liaisons. And I think that that is a really good idea. But I also want to underscore that the example that we saw with that we are seeing with the 121 East Catherine process is led by someone who is a professional facilitator, and that's what she does for her job. And she's a respected member of the community. And so I don't know what we can do with, I don't know if we can have a training program to make versions of her that wouldn't be obviously professional, but they would be as effective in ways that we're not able to be. And they could be bridges, they could be trusted a little bit and, help us build trust. I think it's a really complicated problem that you've uncovered in the report. And I think trying to bite off what it would mean to act on some of these, it's really big. And I think it's good to think more. And also, I think you know this, but in solid waste around the circular economy, we worked with OSI and got a grant so that we could do exactly what you're talking about, making a public engagement strategy that really will be equitable because the person is doing all this footwork. But we had to apply for a grant to get that. So even the budgeting for these efforts isn't reflecting the kind of, as you call it, pre-work that needs to be done. Before you make the plan, you need to do some stuff so that the plan can actually move in the way that you want it and reverse some of the power dynamics. That wasn't a question, it was my reaction and the themes that I'm hearing, and like wow, this is great work. And boy, I hope we can really understand the support that we need to build the capacity to do it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that comment because it does take a lot of work and it does take more staff power than what we have right now, because it's really about getting out to people instead of expecting them to come to us. And the engagement hub, that's an example. I highlighted that because that is something that we'll probably be able to do soon, but that you're right, because it's a low-hanging fruit. It's just kind of a better version of what we're doing now. But to really go out, like truly go out and meet people where they're at, both physically and emotionally, mentally, it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of care and thought. And that's where I'm hoping that we're leading. I mean, that is the purpose behind this work that we did with the committee, to showcase that it needs to be done for one thing, and then some methods of how to get there. And then I don't know if you heard in the recommendations, but it was slipped in there that we need the resources. So that is also my hope, that the city starts providing resources. This is in part to make that case that we need the resources to do that, hiring more staff, training staff, getting all the materials that we need to be able to do this work.
Well, let's get it in the budget, because this is budget season now. And I know that, things are getting finalized, but, it doesn't make sense to talk about equity if we aren't going to budget for it. And I think there'd be openness on council to do that. Now, what council wants to give up of its pet projects in order to fund that, I can't guarantee, but we can make a good case for it.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Lee.
Thank you. I think this was a really great presentation. Thank you for sharing this with us. Two quotes that I saw in the report that I wanted to kind of point out was, if they had listened to the surveys instead of doing what they want in the end, or some indication that my input wasn't being ignored. And I love the idea of charrettes and different mediums of expression, because talking publicly can be a little scary, right? And it can kind of suppress through anxiety, like the freedom of expression. How do we make it really clear that we heard and that there's a relationship between the input and the outcome? Because ultimately you want to create some level of a positive feedback loop, that your engagement was meaningful, that it was heard. And so really one of the items that I wanted to also point towards was there's continue increasing staff training and conducting quality engagement, but also how to train us to be better communicators of consideration of your point. And I think that kind of positive feedback loop is very important to continue to say, your feedback does make a difference. And I'm not sure, you know, how to make that more apparent and more felt in folks that do engage. So I would think that something to the effect of even training for us to meaningfully show the relationship between the outcomes as well as the input would be helpful. And that's kind of like point number one that I had was how do we convey the consideration and the relationship between that, and how can we be more trained in that respect? And then the other things that I wanted to actually kind of talk about kind of openly here is the milestones for successful engagement, outcomes and suitable measurables. And so to me, kind of better understanding the framework of what that looks like. Whether it's, you know, I wrote a lot of words here, but I'm not sure how they kind of like fit in, but trying to understand outcomes of what we're looking to effectuate. Is it the kind of like the demographic match so that we don't necessarily have disproportionate representation based on the census? Or what is the kind of statistical outcome that we are looking for? And how do we measure success? So whether it's, again, we talked a lot about access, so the accessibility, whether it's, you know, I really like the, there were some of the U of M student, the School of Information, suggestions about personalized updates and things of that nature, but really kind of thinking about what outcomes and what the milestones for successful engagement are. I think that's going to be really important to say, hey, this is kind of what we're hoping to achieve. And then the last item as it pertains to planning commission, and this might be more of a practical thing from a budgetary standpoint, was is there kind of a last mile access support for folks that want to come out on Tuesday evenings? So whether it's AAATA or May Mobility or some kind of relationship that helps people to get to City Hall. I mean, we can try to effectuate the built environment through, you know, obviously connected. I saw that we actually just got the snowplow thing for the bike lanes. That was in the news, so that's always helpful. But can there be more support towards, you know, helping people to get access to City Hall when they want to? So those are the kind of the three things. So let me just recap real quick. It was milestones for successful engagement. I think a lot of critical thinking needs to go into what are the outcomes that we want to look to effectuate. How do we encourage more positive feedback loop and not, you know, we don't want to give off the impression that my input wasn't being ignored. How do we help that, and how do we be better at conveying that kind of like consideration? The last mile access support, and then the, you know, improving curiosity, because that's to me what, you know, engagement is kind of focused on, is how do you make people more curious about things? And so improving the intentionality of curiosity and the tolerance of anxiety and uncertainty and engagement. So those are some of my thoughts. So yeah, again, outcomes, defining that, increasing staff training, including commission training on how to better, you know, communicate consideration and relationship between input, and increasing positive feedback loop and potential support for folks that want to come to City Hall during meetings and things of that nature. So those are my thoughts regarding it. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. That is something that we did talk about, is how do people know how the decision was made or what the actual outcome is. That's something that we're a little bit hit or miss about, where we'll report back out on a survey, for example, that this was the decision that was made. And that's the baseline that we could do, is just say what the decision is. But really, we should be explaining why the decision was made. And sometimes that gets covered during a meeting itself. But if people aren't coming to the planning commission meeting or the city council meeting to see that deliberation, then it's hard to really understand. So I think we can do a better job at documenting that and kind of giving the tracing back, this is the input that we received that was balanced against budgetary reasons or technical feasibility or the other things that we need to balance it against. And so this is why the conclusion was the way it was. So explaining that back out to the public. We also talked about if we want to weight things, if we're looking at actually advancing equity, we didn't really get far enough to come up with how we would do this, but if we're thinking about serving people that have been underserved in the past, how do we weight the input a little bit differently rather than this is just what we heard back? So that's something that we need to look into a little bit further. So yeah, I definitely, that's something that we need to do as both staff, I think, and as leaders in the community, is really communicating that back to the community, how we made that decision. Let's see, what was the other one? If you could refresh me.
Oh, sure. The last mile access support,
Yeah.
for folks, looking to get to City Hall to engage.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great idea. Any way that we can get people here, or again, you're a little bit confined because of you are the planning commission versus just a project-based group that's coming together. So, but in other scenarios on these project-based examples, we want to get out to people, not expect people to come to City Hall. So finding, easier ways for people to access. But in the scenario where they do have to come to City Hall, I love that idea of like working with the ride or, other entities, or maybe creating a ride share. I don't know what it might be, but that's a great suggestion. Something that we can throw in, put into the report as something to consider. And then curiosity, that's the other thing. Like, how do we increase curiosity? That was part of my intention with the class of students, just to get really what that originally came from is just getting young people interested in planning, because I didn't learn about planning until pretty late in the game. And I just want younger people to have a better chance at knowing that this is a profession that they can get involved in. And even if they don't become a planner, that they have a role to play in deciding things in their community. So I think we can do things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a class, but again, getting out to people in some way where we're educating that they do have a role to play, and there are things that they can have influence over in the community. And hey, did you ever wonder, just kind of revealing that things just don't just happen, that there are decisions behind it. And these are the ways that you get involved in the decisions. And this is how the decisions are made. So again, that takes more staff resources, and it's kind of an educational component of engagement. But I think there are some really fun ways, actually going back to what Commissioner Dish was talking about with the Catherine engagement. A lot of that was storytelling. And that's something that has been on my mind lately. Like, how can we do more of that? Just like hearing people's stories and their relationship with Ann Arbor and this community, and how that can evolve into conversations about what we want to see for the future of our community. So maybe doing something fun like that, like just having a storytelling hour, or I don't know, just other creative ways for people to express themselves other than these stuffy meetings that we all come to know.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner White.
Thanks for the presentation, and did get a chance to look at it before the meeting today. One thing I just want to name that I saw in the data, but I wasn't sure I saw in any of the recommendations or the responses, is that the community engagement as measured seems to overrepresent a specific group in the city. So it overrepresents wealthy folks. So if we measure wealth at 71,000, which is the US median household, over 78% of your respondents are above that number. Number two, it overrepresents landowners in the city, even though the city is a majority renter city, with over 84% of the respondents being landowners. And then it overrepresents race and ethnicity with over 91% or 91% of the respondents being white. This, I mean, just a reaction and a reflection, it just feels like an institutional misalignment, you know, like with the city, or maybe even a failure of the institution to engage its residents. And I didn't see in the recommendation and in the report how those things were going to be addressed. So if there are clear milestones for addressing each of those, I think that would be really helpful, because it seems to me that we're just hearing from one group within the city: white, wealthy landowners.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. White, wealthy, older landowners is exactly who we're hearing from. And it's not just even the same group, but it's often the same people, like the exact people that are showing up at the meeting. So that is actually the whole effort behind this, the development of this report, is to address that. We agree with you that we think that we're failing if we're just hearing from the same people. And it's, you know, and what does that mean towards decision making? Like, how much should we even bring in the input? You know, how much weight should we put towards that if we're just hearing from the same people and they're having all the influence of what the decisions are in the community? Yeah, so all of the recommendations really are actually meant to get to that. So starting with addressing what the composition of city staff is to begin with. And we had a lot of conversations about that. The fact that the staff itself isn't representative of the community. So how can we, you know, how can people really have that trust with us? So that's one area that was put into the report that I didn't think actually that we would talk so much about, because I wanted just to get to let's talk about engagement. But fundamentally, if the city itself doesn't look representative and we don't seem authentic or sincere, then we can't establish that trust with people. People aren't going to engage with us. So that's the first recommendation. And then from there, it kind of goes into how we do our outreach. So actually being really intentional. So one of the main reasons why we're seeing that profile of people come to our meetings is because we've been really passive about it. We just put out our notifications, and whoever sees them then comes, and whoever has the time to do it, you know, basically comes to our meetings and engages. So a lot of the people that come are people who are already engaged, that they're already on one of our email lists, or they know how to find the information. So figuring out ways that we actually get to the people that haven't already been engaged or know how to get to the information. So different ways of getting the notification out and inviting people, and then making it easier for people to get here or to a meeting or to some engagement event. And that is actually going to people instead of, again, you know, being passive and expecting people to come to us. So what does that look like? So a lot of the recommendations center on ways that just make it more accessible for people.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm struggling with is that if the solution is to diversify the staff, I don't see how that's going to address the feedback that we're getting. So I've been on planning now for about 16 months, maybe 18 months. And there is a group of people who are mobilized, who come and speak at planning. And so I don't know that the representation of the planning table changes who's showing up with engagement. So that solution feels misaligned. And from my point of view, I'm not an expert in this area, but it does feel misaligned if the goal is to increase the plurality of voices that we want to hear. And as someone in the city who has been paying close attention to how engagement occurs, with most recently with our unarmed public safety program and the entity that engaged there, the city had fantastic choices outside of the choice that they made. And we discovered that the entity that they selected they were unable rather to engage with all elements of the community. And so new kinds of engagements had to be created. And if you talked to anyone, or even the people who put in those bids to do that public engagement, they have experience doing that. So it's not that we don't have the skills and the experience within the community. It's that the people who are making the decision are making decisions not to engage those individuals. So those things just feel misaligned for me in the report, but maybe there's something that I'm missing there. If it's okay, I'm going to move on to my next point. I continue to see children are missing from all of our community engagement. I heard you talk about youth, but I heard that being bounded by high school, which means because I don't see it in the report, I don't know if we're talking to middle schoolers, and I don't know if we're talking to elementary kids. So especially for planning, a lot of the work we do is multi-generational work. So we approve something, it's going to be here for 20, 30, 40 years, but we're not engaging the people who are going to inherit the decisions that we've made. And I just think that is a missed opportunity. I think it's an institutional failure on our part. We over-represent the people who are already here, and we don't hear from the people who are going to be here as much. And if you take our meeting, for instance, it's Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Kids aren't going to come to that. That's prime time for meals and family time and homework, baths, things along those lines. So structurally, it seems we have designed our system to structurally exclude those voices without us having to explicitly exclude them. And that just, every opportunity I get, I'm trying to bring it up, as Mr. Leonard will tell you, because I just don't think it's good. I think it's a missed opportunity for us to engage. And if anybody wants to walk to school with my 8-year-old in the morning, my 8-year-old can explain to you how the roads are poorly designed, how they're unsafe, how they don't communicate the right information for her to make decisions about crossing the street, how cars drive too fast, how she feels unsafe because they won't stop when she's in the intersection. She has a lot to say. Like I hear it all day, and we'll come up to it, and she's like, "This is a bad light." And I go, "All right, like, will you come to a meeting and tell us?" And she's like, "No, I'm coming to a meeting and telling you all this. I'm telling you, you go to the meeting and tell them." But why can't we go and spend some time with our grade school kids during drop off or pickup and ask them questions about land use and how that works and how to get around in their neighborhood or how they would like to get out of their neighborhood. Our neighborhood is locked. You have to have a vehicle to get out of our neighborhood. There's only like one path in our entire sub of over 900 houses that gets you out of our sub into a major artery. Again, I just think there's some missed opportunities. And then my last point is around the educational piece. The thing that I've noticed the most, and I think this gets to Chair Gibrano's comment for me, is we don't do a good job explaining how our system works. We assume that people understand how things work. And as a matter of fact, just from our last working session, we had a resident who was very upset that the commissioners asked questions of the developers. Why did you do that after the residents got off of the phone? And I was like, because it is structured that way. I cannot engage you. I am supposed to engage the developers. I can pick up your comment. I can ask the chair for discretion if the chair wants to grant that, but it's not designed for an interactive process, but people come to it expecting what Commissioner Lee is talking about, which is giving their voice about what they feel or how they see their neighborhood transforming and changing. And then we listen, we all do, every one of us listen. Often we pick up their comments and we will ask their comments directly of the developer or work it into our own piece so that we can get answers. But that feels like a disconnect. And then people don't understand the law. So it's like everything that you're saying is valid and there are rules. And if the developer meets these rules, we don't have a good reason to say no. So if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but these are the rules. And then we have to realize we create the rules. So just some thoughts around, like, if we are talking about engagement, could a rubric be developed for boards and commissions like ours that do sort of a 101 or sort of a preamble for the community to say, like, here's how this works. Here's what you're going to see tonight. Here's how you get to speak. Here's how we take that feedback into decision making. And then here's what you're going to see us do. So that, I mean, we often get people who are sitting in the audience. They're like, well, can I speak now? And we're like, nope, your time for speaking is here and here. And it's like, before we make the decision and after we make the decision. So we send a very clear message to people. We want to hear from you, but when it's time to make the decision, we make the decision, and then we'll hear from you about whether you liked our decision or not. That might be good, that might be bad, but it is how it is. And I think we should tell people that. So, like, I would love to see some kind of tool that a commission like ours could use out of the work that you're doing to help better educate our residents, and especially around planning. Planning is a complicated apparatus. It's big, but it impacts every aspect of everyone's life. And so it's very emotional. And the one thing that was missing, at least again in my reading of the document, was how do we help people process the emotion that they have about the decisions that are being made on their behalf. And we get yelled at a lot. And, or rather, I should say, I have gotten yelled at a lot. And I don't appreciate being yelled at. But I'm happy to engage people because I think this work is important. And I want to see the human flourishing of our entire city and the inclusion of everyone. So thanks for the work that you've brought. Would love to just see kids involved more, and maybe a product for a commission like ours, like a rubric that could help people with their engagement.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. I love the idea of engaging younger kids. They just have so much interesting things to say. So insightful. Yeah, more than people give them credit for. So yes, I would love to do something more with younger children. And the rubric is such a great idea. I think we could definitely come up with something like that.
Any other questions or comments? Commissioner Hammerschmidt.
Thanks. And thanks, Heather. I'm sorry we're not at City Hall with you.
I'm sorry that the lights went out.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here in the dark. Oh well.
This is a really great presentation, so thanks for being here. I wrote down a lot of stuff. I'm gonna try not to like necessarily go through all of it because I have a lot of thoughts, and I'll dig more into the report and send you any other feedback. But I guess my first question is like, what, like, you mentioned, getting things into the, you need resources to do some of this work and to meet some of these recommendations, but like what, absent that, like say you got resources, like what are the next steps for this report? Like what's going to happen with the steering committee? Like who's going to implement this work? Like, have you guys sort of thought through that?
Yeah, the steering committee, so we've been meeting for about 1.5 years, and it was meant to be about a year-long commitment for them. We're going to have a potluck next and just kind of celebrate that we did this work. So we'll be getting together to do that, which I'm really excited about because we've done most of our meetings, or all of them, online. And then from there, we're going to be eventually taking this to City Council to present. It's a report, so it's not a plan. So it'll be hopefully accepted. And then from there, hopefully we start programming stuff into our budget. So getting things rolling out. And we do have people on staff, my colleague, Michelle Bennett, who I think some of you have met in other settings. She'll be working to advance this. There'll be somebody else that's hired as a community engagement specialist. And this is more or less going to be the playbook for people who are hired in as community engagement specialists to try to advance it. And even though, as I mentioned earlier, that we're going to call this a final report probably in a month or so, it's not really final. Like, it'll always be evolving. We're always going to be learning. We're always going to be growing. We're always going to be, trying to be the best that we can be with this work. So we'll be taking the recommendations that we have and trying to advance those, and then continuing to figure out ways that we can continuously be better.
I think you mentioned like potentially engaging steering committee members as like, hiring, when you were talking about hiring people as like liaisons and stuff. It'd be interesting if there's like budget again, but like to pilot some of these things. Like I just, as you were talking about just different strategies, I just kept thinking like we have so many different types of engagement. And I think, you're talking before about like when Commissioner White was talking, like creating like a rubric for different like engagement. I mean, I think the way that people engage with planning, and we talked about this the other day with like the developer requirement, like it would be great if the developers could have some sort of playbook, like based on your community engagement tool. I don't know if they look at it or not, but like something beyond just the postcard and the online meeting and the check the box and the blah, blah, blah. Like we never get meaning. I feel like we don't get anything meaningful out from that. And I don't know that developers are taking that as seriously as they could. So like for us, like something, if they did more robust community engagement up front, maybe we wouldn't have as many like potentially angry people calling us and blaming us for making these, decisions that we have to make because it's within, our code. But for specific types of engagement, like what are the different strategies that have been either piloted by the city, have been best practices from other communities, et cetera, just sort of like a menu of options would, I don't know, that could be, I think, really helpful. How do you see this report and all of this work sort of interfacing with the comprehensive plan? Yeah, I heard a lot of the things that I think Interface is planning to do. I saw a lot of the things in the report, but just, did those conversations come up as you were creating this? Because like, obviously, Brett has something to say too. Obviously, community engagement, I think, is like a foundational piece of the comprehensive plan if we're going to get it right.
Yeah, it needs to be. Yeah, I'll let Brett answer this, but I absolutely wholeheartedly, especially as a planner, like we need really good community engagement as we move forward with our comprehensive plan.
It's kind of on you, Commissioner Hammerschmidt.
Yeah.
In all seriousness, you as the planning commissioner are going to be the authors of this report. You are going to be overseeing and stewarding this process. And so part of that is you participating in, measuring, evaluating, and being accountable that the product and the process that we ultimately develop, implement, and achieve meets these goals to the effect that we think it can. The challenges are the same challenges you're seeing here. It's going to be resources, it's going to be time, it's going to be education, it's going to be our comfort level with to what measures have we identified gaps and to what measures did we successfully take or unsuccessfully take to try and build a more rounded snapshot of the chorus of our community. And we've talked a lot about even aspirational members of our community. It might be inclusive of those that aren't in our community, but those are really important voices for us to understand the barriers that we present financially, practically, anecdotally, you name it, to people joining our community who want to be here. So this is absolutely, I'm grateful for the timing. I've been grateful for Heather's inviting me along for the ride at different times. But I want to kick that back to you a little bit and the rest of the commission. That's going to be on us to make sure that we are confident that we are achieving these goals to the best we can.
Okay, please keep reminding me and us of that. but that's yay. I mean, I'm just going to say this out loud so I remember, like, I think it could be good potentially to get, Interface and their partners in a meeting, like with the steering committee, to just sort of like, they've worked on this for so long and clearly have had some really well thought out ideas and know our city. Maybe that could be a good starting point. So just saying that out loud, so it's, recorded for posterity. Something else I actually just thought of as you were talking, in kind of the going back to what I was saying about like piloting some of these recommendations, if that's even possible. Like, how do we know, back to Commissioner White's point of like, we see this data, and like, we've all said this, like, it's a lot of the same people that engage. Like, how do we know that any of these new strategies are actually going to get us new people? Like, have you been doing any things like over the past 18 months where you're seeing new people? Like, do we have new data? Like, have you seen the needle getting moved? How do we know? So many different things to do. It's like, how do we know? Like,
Yeah, actually, that was the whole purpose of starting to collect the demographic data back in 2019. We're like, okay, well, we'll get an understanding of who's coming to our meetings now, and then try different things and see if that makes a difference. And then COVID hit, and so then everything was online. So we haven't been able to try out a lot of stuff, but it did allow us to take this time to actually put together this committee and actually think through different interventions and different changes to how we approach community engagement instead of just kind of trying things. So we that is something that we do want to do, and we'll continue to track at minimum the demographic data, but we also want to come up with some sort of survey or some sort of feedback loop about how people feel, how effective people feel the engagement is. If they feel like they're being placated, or if they feel like they're actually being heard and listened to, and that their involvement makes a difference.
And again, I think it goes back to like what the opportunity is, because I think there are situations where it literally is just kind of like collecting input and it's anonymous and like, but then there's, really deep engagement, like we hopefully will have for the comprehensive plan, where it's like, you could play a role and you will play a role in shaping, the values of the city. So I think that's not always clear to people, like what I think people to come to planning commission meetings and yell at us about a project and like expect to get their way and don't always understand. It is the educational component, I think, of just like, what are the decisions being made out of this engagement process? And like, how does your input actually, make a difference? Or how is it being heard? The last thing is just sort of a reflection on the first recommendation you had when you were talking about, hiring, more diverse people, city staff. And I just want to sort of like, that just made me think, like, in the development community writ large, we sort of have this like pipeline problem of there aren't always, it's like 2% of architects are Black. So it's like, if every firm goes out and tries to hire a Black architect, like, they're just, that's just not, just trying to like pad your numbers. Or anyway, I just wondered if you guys had any conversations or had any thoughts about like training programs, or even like to get, Ann Arbor's an expensive place to live. It's like, I don't know if the city, again, this is money, but like, help with down payments on housing or something like that to like attract people from outside that might be more diverse candidates that couldn't otherwise live here. I think it's just hard to, we want our staff to better reflect the community, but when, if there aren't training, if they're not like training or education in place to like meet what the city needs on staff, then it's hard to do. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think it's something like the development industry at large is like struggling with.
And I think that goes back to the youth component as well. You really just getting people while they're younger, to help them understand that they have an opportunity, and that, that they have a role to play, and could potentially become a profession and influencing the shape of communities, and teaching them what that is. But that's easier said than done. That does take resources, and we're lucky with community high school because it's just on the road and they're structured in a way that I could have a class come over to City Hall, but not even all the high schools in Ann Arbor are like that. So that's something that we need to work on, is figuring out how to really roll that out and make it more widespread and get to those younger generations that Commissioner White was talking about. And actually that reminds me, one of the other things that's been rattling around in my mind is doing games. My child worked at Fall to Midnight and we're just kind of a board gaming family. And I just think that would be a really great way to connect with youth as well as anybody, actually make it kind of fun in that way. So if anybody has any ideas about that, I'd love to, oh my gosh, lights are on. I'd love to develop that thinking about, how can we, I don't know, create games or, things like that, different fun ways to engage people.
I was going to say this before you even said that, but this kind of fits in. The Urban Land Institute has a program called Urban Plan, and I know ULI Michigan, like not all of the local chapters like implement it, but it's basically like learning the development process with Legos. And so they go into high schools, like everybody sort of plays a role. Like you could learn about like the financial part, the developer part, the community part. And I think it's been really effective. And they do this across the country, and they're doing it in Detroit, but I don't see any reason why we couldn't talk to them about bringing it to Ann Arbor.
Yeah, well, and that might be, how the planning commission teaches people, is to do something like that versus just something that we put on paper and hand out.
They have a version for public officials actually too.
Yeah.
Learn the planning development process.
Yeah.
And Commissioner Reich, I just want to let you know, we talked a lot about youth, meaning like little kid engagement, like with both of the consultant teams. Like I wanted to do my dissertation research, like working with kids and how they experience cities. But then the IRB stuff just got too challenging. But like, I'm with you, like kids just see cities in very different and unique ways from us and adults. And we don't always listen because, it's like, oh, your kids, you don't know, but like, they do, and they really need to be listened to. And I think they will have really important things to say. And I am excited, and I am holding myself accountable to making sure that we figure out a really robust, like elementary, middle school engagement strategy for the comp plan. Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
I have a couple of other kind of follow-up thoughts on things that people were saying. One is a little bit of historical context. Commissioner Mills is going to remember this. Pre-pandemic, we regularly had high school classes coming to our meetings, as well as U of M classes coming to our meetings, and we would have to sign their little forms and stuff like that. And I think it was Skyline. There was a teacher at Skyline that sent them over. And I think that is awesome, because like they are seeing like, this is where the sausage is made. This is how it happens, and a lot of them look bored during the whole process, because sometimes it is boring, right? I mean, it's just like there's a lot of churning through things. But if there's any way to be able to reach out to people like like you all did with community, to be able to reach out to civics, government, whatever it is, they have to take. I think there is something to actually showing up at City Hall to see what that's about too, that is powerful, that's different than just showing up to a Zoom. But that I think would be a really great thing to try to engender again. Clearly somebody had to be in their bonnet about it at Skyline, and they did it. But it would be great to see if there's a way to kind of spark that in any of our other high schools to allow that to happen, because I think that it was great for us. Every once in a while, one of them would get up and say something, so it was cool for us too. Another historical context thing is, I've been on planning commission since 2015, but before that, I, came in front of planning commission a lot. And before the postcard, planning commission meetings would regularly go till 1 or 2 in the morning, like regularly. And so if you think it's like that actually cuts a lot off of the kind of people wondering what the heck is going on. And so it is not perfect. And I feel like it could get a lot better, but it has gotten a whole lot better than it used to be, because we would, it would be standing room only. People would be coming up and having their 3 minutes, and they would take advantage of the beginning of the meeting, and the end of the meeting both times, so it was really intense. So I think the more that we can do any kind of meaningful dialogue for people before, I think is helpful, because I think we are somewhat hamstrung, I think, by our meeting format. But the other thing I feel like that I've just seen over time since I've been on the commission, and it's inspiring me to think about channeling some of these personalities that have been here in the past, is that there's kind of always been a person on commission that's really good at addressing comments that none of us really want to address, but that are either not going to work because of code or are, something that we don't, our values aren't particularly aligned with, in terms of like, whatever, people are going to park in front of my house, and inside I may be saying, I don't really care if people park in front of your house, but I think that we should be able to address that, to really articulate why to people, because I feel like we don't necessarily address everybody's comment. And there are some things that don't fit, whatever, but it feels like the honorable thing to do is to actually respond and say why. And so I guess I challenge all of us to think about that. So it's not just one person all the time and things like that. So that, because that's kind of a thankless job to take that on. But I think that it is something like people are going to show up more, even if you say, I'm sorry, we can't do what you're asking. This is why. Than if we just ignore it. And I think we have been ignoring some of those comments. So that's just something for all of us, I guess, to think about when we get people that, bring things up that are kind of outside of our purview, or for whatever reason, we're just not responding to. So that's I'm asking everybody to kind of think about how we all might be able to take that on, so that we are beginning to rise to this challenge of being able to allow people to really feel like, okay, I'm being heard. And I think that starts with us responding to whatever they brought up. And sometimes we do that and sometimes we don't. So.
Yeah, and that raises something else that Commissioner White talked about, is just the emotionality of planning and how do you manage that? And so what you're saying, or what I'm hearing, is that, we need to be better equipped at responding to people who are coming forward. We also need to be able to manage that in ourselves, and I think it's really hard as a professional planner and a planning commissioner when you are in just kind of this emotional arena a lot and being yelled at quite often. I actually have another presentation on that, which I'd be happy to come back and talk to people about, because it is something that's so significant to this industry, to planning, to this field, that we're not really trained in officially. There's no training in school, but it is something that a skill that we need to learn, is to how to recover from those moments and come to the table with compassion, and how to skillfully respond to people who are often yelling at us or coming across negatively because they're reacting from fear. They're afraid that something's being taken away from them, or some sort of change is going to have an adverse effect on their life. So trying to find ways to come to the table remembering that, so that we can actually have an effective, productive community conversation about something.
Anybody else have thoughts? Comments, questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. That was a really great dialogue. So thank you for responding to everybody and to presenting what you have. And I really appreciate all of my colleagues' comments too. It's really helpful to hear everybody's thoughts. So
thank you so much for having me. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. And sorry for the bumpy start with being at City Hall and scrambling a little bit, but I appreciate that we were able to have a conversation and all of your thoughts. This was really wonderful to have this discussion.
I'm glad the lights came on for you.
You too.
Okay, well, now we are moving on to our final public comment. So this time I'll see if since there was something in front of people to be able to respond to. If anybody wants to speak to the commission, they can press *9 if listening by phone, or use the raise hand feature if viewing through the web link. For phone access, call 877-853-5247 and enter meeting ID 977-6634-1226. And to unmute, press *6. So city staff will select callers that have raised their hand using the last 3 digits of your phone number or your name. If you're viewing through the web link, when speaking, please move to a quiet area and mute television or background sound so that we may hear you clearly. Please state your name and address at the beginning of your comments. Anybody waiting in the queue?
Yes, at this time we have 2 people in the queue, and our first caller is Brian Chambers. Brian Chambers, you have permission to speak.
You might try pressing *6 to unmute if you're on the phone.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Excellent. Please go
Okay,
ahead.
my apologies. I had to mute and then unmute. With regard to equitable engagement and the comprehensive land use update, I suggest 2 items. One is the outreach to the most hard to reach communities is important. And so what I have to say is not meant to back off from that, but I want to emphasize the lower middle income segment of the population, those between 50 and 100,000 in household income. You said one of your demographics showed a bias towards or an over-representation of those between 100 and 150,000 income per year. And if you only reach out to the hardest to reach, you'll be skipping over the lower middle income strata. And I just want to make sure you're aware that that might be a possibility, and to work to mitigate not doing that, for lack of a better term, because they're the ones getting squeezed out of Ann Arbor. You may have heard my name in terms of the middle income needs analysis report I did on housing. For those below 150 grand a year, we have reduced rates of home ownership. If you get below 50 grand a year, we have reduced rates of rentership, meaning they can't even live in Ann Arbor anymore. And it's that middle segment of loss of home ownership that might be most impacted by land use decisions. I'm not saying ignore the lower end, but I'm just saying don't miss that lower middle income range. Now, for the comprehensive land use update, how do you do that? I don't know what you're considering, and this may or may not make sense for you, but if you had a steering committee that was demographically diverse, so that at least half was in the 20 to 30s range, so it's not biased towards the older income, and that you had a significant portion of those experiencing housing stress to some degree. I'm just thinking that there's a way to set up the comprehensive land use update so that it's not just about public engagement as out there. You're actually having it as part of the steering committee of the comprehensive plan update process. You've made sure it's equitable. You made sure it has equitable engagement within the steering committee. And heaven forbid that you would create a subcommittee on equity. Just please don't do that. So I don't know what else to say. So make sure that the comprehensive land use update has a seat at the table for everyone across the spectrum, and that it's biased towards those missing segments that you've experienced. And if you do a survey, make sure you account for the demographics of the survey, that you can adjust all of the responses by ethnicity and income. I'll just leave it at that. I'm losing my 3 minutes now, so thank you very much.
Thank you. We have one more.
Our next caller is Sarah Nisbet, and Sarah Nisbet, you have permission to speak.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. This is Sarah Nisbet. I live at 837 West Huron Street here in Ann Arbor. And I just wanted to express my appreciation for the conversation that you're having around engaging the community in the city planning process. I have arrived at these meetings through kind of hurdling through some of the barriers that you've discussed here already. I grew up in Ann Arbor, moved away for about 15 years, and I'm now sort of making my home here again. And as I've walked through downtown and sort of seen some of the changes that have happened and the buildings that are being built and the development that's happening, felt frustration and anger and sort of disempowered, and just so happened to share that with a neighbor who's lived here for about 70 years. And she was like, you got to go to the planning meetings. She's like, my generation did it. It's your turn to do it now. You have to go be involved. And that just really struck me. And I thought, okay, this is how we make change. And I just want to say, sort of express two things. One is that I think as our kind of larger culture is shifting into really polar, really divisive, ignorant stances, there's this beautiful solution of participating in our community, and it happens in places like this. And I am learning that for myself as a full adult. And it's been really wonderful to come to these meetings, which has been my resolution to do this year. But I want to share also that in starting the process of coming to these meetings, it was really hard just to find, the Zoom link and the passcode. And I had to, I think I'm a pretty smart person, and I had to call City Hall and find out how to do it. And so that was a hurdle that, in another time in my life, I probably would have just said, it's too hard. So I share that just to say that the conversation you're having is wonderful. And I think I am learning about the process that you guys go through here and what you contribute to shaping our community. And I'm sharing about that with my friends and my peers, and I think inspiring them to be a part of it. But it is hard. There are a lot of hurdles to join. And so I just want to commend you and encourage you to really continue to do this work to make it easier for people to participate in what is democracy. This seems to be it in its nitty-gritty beauty. So I thank you guys for your work and for the attention to making it easier for people to participate in creating our community alongside you. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have no other hands raised at this time.
All righty. Okay, and if there's no other comments, I think that we can adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.